All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Ken Rudin, and I have led product teams and product marketing teams, and more specifically, growth teams at companies like Salesforce and Zynga and Meta over the years. And when I take a step back and I look at some of the things that I've learned there, a few years ago I had a really interesting insight, which was when I look at the growth of these companies, they all had significant and consistent growth for many, many years. When I looked at how that growth was generated, my realization was that the majority of that growth was coming from focusing on our existing features rather than launching new features. And that prompted me to take a step back and think about, how do I put this into a repeatable process so that instead of just something that we realize after the fact that, hey, most of this growth is coming from focusing on what we already have versus launching new things, how can we put together a repeatable process that we can use in lots of different companies? And that was the genesis of something that is called the ARIA Framework, and we'll be talking about that in the next few minutes. The goal of the ARIA Framework is to help you figure out, give you a structured process for figuring out which parts of your product are the ones you want to promote, how you promote them, and who you promote it to. And it's a combination of things in the app, as well as things we can do through channels when the user is not in the app. And for those of you who are familiar with Lenny Rachitsky and Lenny's newsletter, he asked that I write a guest post earlier this year, so if you want to find out more details than I'll be going into today, you can look up that post as well. But I want to take a step back and start with some background. If you think about how product teams consider themselves, and we all know lots and lots of people who lead product teams, when you talk to them about how are you planning on driving growth for the business, they see themselves, they see their primary focus as, we're going to build new features. And of course we do need new features. The market changes, the customers that you are servicing, their needs change, and we need to add more features so we can add more value into the product. But the challenge is, or the real problem here is that product teams over-index on new features. Really the belief there is that if you want to drive significant growth, the way to do that is we need to launch something big. And there was something about 8 years ago or so, maybe even 9 years ago now, where I had my first experience with the issues that this creates. And this takes us back to about 2015. I had just joined Google, and my charter there was to lead their growth team, to start and lead their growth team. And we started by working on our cash cow, which is, of course, Google search. And at the time, in 2015, we started looking at some of the data there, and we saw that on average, within a month, anyone who uses Google in the United States, they were using it, surprisingly to me, only 12 times a month. So our conclusion there was that we already had 93% of the market at the time. So it wasn't about getting new users, it was about getting existing users to search a lot more. If they're only doing 12 searches a month, I don't know about you guys, but I probably do at least 12 a day. There's a lot of headroom to grow engagement. And we started doing some analysis on how we could do that. And we looked at what types of searches were most engaging. And what we found was that this notion of a dynamic search, something where the results of the search change over time, either every time you do the search or daily. Some examples here, like sports scores. I can search for sports scores for my favorite team every day, and I'll get different scores. That changes every day. I can look at weather, I can look at movies. These are the types of searches that if people do them, they tend to do them again and again. Versus static searches like, how tall is the Statue of Liberty, or when was Winston Churchill born? Those answers never change, so unless you have issues with memory, you tend not to ask those questions more than once. within this set of dynamic searches, sports scores were by far the most engaging. And when I looked at sports scores, I looked specifically at soccer, which is the world's most popular sport. And we did a survey of Google users, and we found that only 12% of users even knew that you could get soccer scores from Google. So that was one data point that means that there's very low awareness of this, but the people who are using it, there was a very high repeat rate. On average, they used at least a sports score type of search at least twice a month. In parallel, I started talking to the team within Google Search that was responsible for building out this sports domain, and sports scores were part of it. And I asked them what's on their roadmap going forward. And they had already built out functionality for the world's most popular sports, like basketball and baseball and football and soccer and cricket and tennis. So they were looking at what is next on our roadmap, and these were the 3 top items that they were going to be building next. So it was lacrosse, sumo wrestling, and table tennis, which I learned after the Olympics to not call ping pong. And I don't know how many of you are lacrosse or sumo wrestling fans, and no offense, but it's just not a very popular sport worldwide. It's fairly niche. And when you look at something like table tennis, it is really popular, but where is it popular? You know where table tennis is most popular? China. And where is Google banned? China. So we had this option of, it became really apparent that we could focus on building out more features for these more niche sports and get no more than a 12% awareness level of that. So build out more capabilities that very few people are going to use. Or focus on how do we get more people to start searching for things like soccer, the world's most popular sport. And get that above 12%. So we focused on the latter, using a lot of the techniques that I'll talk about as we go forward for the next 30 minutes or so. And we got more growth in the next 9 months in terms of usage of that and searches that were associated with this and the revenue that comes with that. We got more growth in the next 9 months than we had in the prior 3 years. So this was the insight that focusing on things you already have and driving more engagement with it, getting people to be more aware of the capabilities and the benefits can lead to more growth. And some of the questions are, why is that true? Why is this fairly universally true? And there's at least 3 good reasons. One of the first is that when you're building out a product, you put the most important features in, the critical ones, the ones that are the backbone of the capabilities and why people use your product in the first place. You build those first. As the product gets more mature, the features you add tend to be power user features or more niche features versus broad-based foundational features that really form the core of the product. So if the most important features were built first, there's a lot of benefit of getting more people to use that, because that's where the core benefit really comes from. Another point is that whenever you release a feature, you'll see things like maybe 80% of the feature was designed well and it's working well, but 20% probably needs a little bit more work. And that's just a fact of life because you don't know exactly how people are going to use that feature until you actually release it. The challenge is, even though 80% of it works really well, it doesn't mean you get 80% of the value of that feature. That 20% may be things like there's a step that people find confusing in a multi-step process, or something that's just a little bit challenging or difficult for them to do. So for those users, if they get stuck on that 20% and don't complete it, they're getting 0% of the value of what you just launched. And other cases are, well, even if people do get through it, because there's some friction there, they're using it less than they would otherwise. So the realization here is that by trying to focus on improving that last 20% and getting more people to be aware of it, you can unlock 100% of the value for all of your users. So it's a small incremental effort for large incremental benefit. And then the last part is, when we launch new features, we've all gone through the process of, we launch it, we put information out on our website, we send emails to people, and it just doesn't resonate with users. Whenever we launch a feature, there's always a risk that it's not going to deliver what we want it to. And in fact, when you look at the data, roughly 80% of features that are launched don't initially live up to the expectations that the team had when they launched them, in terms of benefits or revenue or engagement. However, if you look at existing features, you already know which ones are resonating with users. So focusing on those is a more sure bet than launching something completely new. So the question is, okay, if you're believing the argument that you can drive more growth by getting your users to focus on a lot of the existing features versus over-indexing on new features, then the question is, how do we do that? How do we decide what features we want them to focus on, and who are we going to promote that to? And the core of the answer to that is the ARIA framework, which stands for, we'll go through each of these steps: analyze, reduce, introduce, and assist. The intent is for it to just be a blueprint that you and companies can use to help you identify what features are the ones you want to focus on and who you should be promoting that to. And then, even in just the last year since I published the article on Lenny's newsletter, the amount of progress we've seen from AI has shown me that using AI with the ARIA framework, coming up with like an AI-infused version of it, which is what we'll talk about today, gives even more impact than we've seen before. By the way, I'm only going to go through some of the high-level things for the ARIA framework. If you want to find out more, you can just go to bit.ly and Ken Lin, and you'll get the full article that gives you a lot more explanation and examples and tactics of how to actually drive growth with the features you already have. So let's start with the first one, which is analyze. The goal of the analyze step, why we started here, is we're trying to identify two things. One is, what are those features that we want to focus on? And two, who do we target them to? So that means we want to create these two assets. We want to create the cohorts of users, and then we want to create a list of features that we believe are the right ones to target to those cohort of users. So let's go through how we do that. The first step is we want to use an LLM and use Gen AI to create the cohorts for us. So we start with all of your users and everything you know about them. And it's a bit of a mess initially, but we can use Gen AI to help us really organize that mess. We take all the data that we know about these users, and really we're looking for data in three different dimensions. It's what they've done with the app, who they are, and where they came from. So what they've done is we're looking at events data. What features did they use? For example, in Amplitude, it'll track all of that. It'll have detailed data of what they've done in the app. Then we're looking at the demographic data, so we know something about who they are. When they signed up, they gave us some information. We can then enrich that with third-party tools like Clearbit and so on. And the last one is from our marketing tools, where did they come from? Because that gives us insight. What channels did they come from? And how did they interacted with us? So we take that information and we feed it into an LLM, and it generates these cohorts for us. Now, the benefit of doing it this way is that historically, the way we would have generated cohorts is we would have used some machine learning model and pumped similar data into it. And we would have gotten cohorts out of it, but first of all, it usually takes many, many months worth of data before you can get the machine learning model to work well. And second, the cohorts that we get out of it, and this is the main problem, are opaque. It gives us which users are in which cohorts, but it doesn't explain to us what those cohorts mean or how it put each of those users into those cohorts. So going forward, when we get another user, we don't know which cohort they're in. We're going to have to run through this model again. We can't get any actual human understandable insight. These cohorts were created just because some mathematical function was optimized when we created those cohorts. When we do it with an LLM, when we ask GenAI to help us, you get cohorts that have meaningful names that we can understand. And it tells you why it put each user into that cohort. What were the criteria that made the decision on, so you can use them going forward. And it can usually do it on far less data than many, many months worth of data. So there's a real strong advantage. And if we look at some examples here of actually going through this process, and this is what you can do in a tool like Humanic. So we start here by, this is the actual output, but where we started was we took our users and we told the tool that this set of users falls into 3 tiers, and we told them which was which. This was the part that we did, so there were free users, basic, and premium users. But after that, we then fed in the data about what they've done, who they are, where they came from, and we asked the GenAI tool to do its magic. And what it comes up with is, first of all, these milestones here. And so this is completely generated by GenAI. So we can see here that it came up with meaningful names for the milestones for people in, we're looking at the free group right now that we had identified, onboarding and product exploration, product engagement, advanced feature usage, and conversion readiness. We have a good sense of what those mean. We could also put them in order of increasing likelihood of converting as we move to the right. And if we were to click on any of these kind of column headers here in these milestones, it would tell us exactly the criteria. So like product exploration or product engagement can be something like, they're in that category because they have used the product at least 4 weeks in a row over the last 5 weeks. Or advanced feature usage. It identifies what it feels are the advanced features, and these are the users who have used at least 2 of those advanced features. That's why they're in that category. And then it goes a step further, and for each of those milestones, it can then categorize each of them into these actual specific cohorts. And again, they have meaningful names that it came up with that were helpful for me to think about. Who are these people? How do I promote to them? And again, I can click on this and drill into why are these people in this category? I can go in and edit that if I want, or create additional rules if I want. So once we're finished with that, we now have these cohorts of users in a meaningful way that we can understand. The next part is, so what features are the ones that we want to focus on? Not every feature in our product is driving growth, which ones are? So for this, we use just a simple standard regression model. There's tons of free tools. You can do it pretty easily in a spreadsheet. We give it 2 pieces of data. The first is, again, the same events data we were using before. But now the second piece of data is what we're looking for in terms of outcomes. We want to drive these particular outcomes. And generally, for the free users, we want to drive something related to conversion, and for the paying users, we want to drive something related to increasing engagement. So we put that in, what features these people have used, and which ones correlate the most with the outcomes that we're looking for, and we get this list of what we call key features. And so now we have the groups of users, the cohorts, and the key features. And we're going to use both of those data sets, both of those outputs, throughout the rest of the steps of this framework. So that was the analyze part. Now we're moving on to reduce. And one of the most consistently effective ways to drive engagement is to reduce the friction of using a particular feature. So we're going to be looking at those key features here. And the first thing we want to do is to say, what can we do to reduce that friction? And there's 3 general ways you can do this. The first is by reducing the number of steps it takes to use that feature Or, by the way, when I talk about features, I'm also referring to user flows like onboarding. You can call that a feature. Or buying something is a feature. So there are features and flows. And for features, we're trying to get more usage. For flows, we're trying to get more people to complete the steps in that flow. So you can reduce the steps to use a feature or a flow. You can reduce the complexity of each individual step. And you can also reduce the kind of cognitive load, meaning what do you need to know beforehand? Are there a whole bunch of new concepts that we want to make sure you know before you can effectively use it? How can we lower each of those? The steps, the complexity per step, and the cognitive load that it puts on you. So I'll just go through two of those. The first one is how you reduce the steps in the process itself. And for any B2B app, the setup flow is going to be a key flow. You can't really get too far in an app. You can't drive engagement. You can't drive conversion if people don't set it up. And so this is certainly true for a product like Amplitude. And this was a screenshot of the Amplitude setup flow as they started looking at how to improve this. So this is the before shot. They looked at some data and they realized that the percentage of people who were completing onboarding was much lower than they thought it should be and they thought it could be. They were spending a lot of marketing dollars getting people to the point of signing up and going through setup, but not finishing. So they wanted to improve that. And they looked at the data and they talked to their users about what some of the issues were. And they came up with this new flow, this active flow, which is simplified. And I will go through a couple areas, just highlight a couple areas in this before and after that are different. So the first one here is the steps that you had to go through before. There were 5 of them. And they realized that 3 of them, well, 2 of them they didn't really need at all. And a third one they could kind of combine with one of the existing ones. So they were able to really distill it down into, you don't need to do the other stuff. Yes, we'd like you to do it, but if it's getting in the way of you completing the core setup process, we're going to remove them. So it's 2 steps then. There are a couple other things. So that's an example of just reducing the steps. But there are also other things they did here, which I just wanted to highlight. They had the full menu bar at the top. But we don't want you to interact with that when you're going through setup. That's just distracting, and people would get curious and click on that and get taken away from this flow and not be sure how to get back. So they just removed it. You can always click on the little Amplitude icon in the upper left and go back to the home page and start something different. But when you're in this flow, remove distractions. And the third thing was clarifying what they actually needed to do to be able to send data to Amplitude, which tracks what users are doing in your app. The first version basically said, here's your API key, and not many people knew what an API key was, and then it's, in that fine text there, it actually says, you may want to grab a developer to help you with this step. And they changed that to, here are the steps, and you can see the first 2 steps are listed here in those green boxes. It gives you code snippets. It makes it much clearer and easier for you to complete. So they saw a 20% increase in people completing this flow just by reducing the complexity. A second thing you can do is, as I mentioned, reducing the effort per step. Once you reduce the number of steps, you can also then reduce the effort for each individual step. And 2 examples I'll go through. One is this notion of, have you ever been through a scenario where you get a document, or have you ever noticed that it's much easier to edit a document that someone sends you than to write one from scratch? Well, it's just a notion that staring at a blank page is always much harder starting from that versus starting with something already there to edit. It's not true 100% of the time, but it is usually true. So this is an example from Google Photos. If you go to the print store in Google Photos, there are options to enable you to print out these high-quality, professional-looking photo books that you can put on your coffee table. This is the primary way that Google Photos makes money. If you've ever wondered how they monetize, this is basically Previously, it was, here are some layouts you can use, add photos, and they weren't seeing that many people actually do this. So if this is our primary way of generating revenue, we want to make it really easy for people to create these photos that they can then print out. So the product team realized that, hey, we can look through the photos, figure out what the events are, and do a professional layout, professional cropping, and so on, and give you a sample photo of them. So this is actually from my page here. You can see it comes up with trips and India and Germany and Tahoe and best of fall for last year. You open them up and they're pretty good as is. And then you look at them, and because it's already 80% of the way done, you're more compelled to then finish it. And we saw a significant increase in people buying books once we gave them something to start with. So we just made this whole process so much simpler. Another thing you can do, which is also really easy, is this notion of using smart defaults within the app itself. This is just an example from American Airlines, where when you go to the website, it automatically fills in a lot of the information for you. It understands from your location that the nearest airport to me was SFO at that time, so it pre-filled that in. And by far the most common tickets sold for them are round trips, so it selects that. And one passenger, so it selects that as well. I can of course change those, but in most cases, the only thing I need to do is tell it where I want to go and when, and it's filled out the rest for me. So these are effective ways in terms of how you reduce the friction using those features, those key features. But doing that, reducing the friction is only part of the problem. It doesn't matter how easy I make it to use a feature if no one knows about it. And that's where Introduce, which is one of the most important steps in all of this, comes into play. We need to make sure that people know about these features. That's a strong effort where marketing is really focused on, is helping people understand the benefits and the capabilities of the product itself. And by the way, when we talk about introducing features, I don't mean your new features. That's a subset of it, but yes, we can introduce your new features. I'm talking about all the features, because the majority of features in your product, I guarantee, most of your users have never used. There are very few users that have used all of your features. So for them, anything they haven't used falls in the category of a new feature. And also, when you think about it, any new user, every feature is a new feature for them. So it's looking at these key features that I've identified before, not just your new ones. In fact, new ones are a minor focus of this. So how do we go about this? Well, I'll talk about 3 different things that we can do in terms of introducing features to get people to engage with those things that are most likely to drive more engagement, more conversion, more revenue, better retention, better monetization. The first thing is, we don't want to just introduce the feature to them. We have to motivate them to use it as well. Yes, we need to tell them about it, but we also need to motivate them. And so to do that, we need to tell something like an LLM what the features are and what their benefits are. So the first step here is to do content prep, where we feed whatever information we have about our features, our docs, any support chats we have, any marketing materials, any of the content on the website. Feed that in, and now it knows about our features and what we have positioned the benefits are. Then we use that and go to the next step here, which is really critical. We're using Gen AI to generate these email sequences, these nudge sequences for our different cohorts. And what we're looking at is, we've taken those cohorts, those things on the left, those are the cohorts that we saw a few screens ago, that Gen AI had defined for us, and then these key features, and the key features that we had looked at, so both of these came from that analyze step. We're looking for each cohort, we're trying to figure out which features are most relevant to them. So it's basically the product of all of those together, and then we're asking the AI system to generate individual sequences, emailing sequences for each of those. The benefit of using Gen AI here is, historically, well, just some math first. generally you'll end up with a few dozen cohorts and half a dozen to a dozen features. And if you do the product and all of that, the number of potential email sequences that you want to create is infeasible for anyone to do by hand. So generally what we've ended up doing historically is we don't really focus too much on the cohorts. We just take all the features and we promote them to all our users. We now have a much more refined way, a much better targeted way of doing this. So not only do we have the ability to create a sequence highly targeted, we can also create the content for each of those sequences highly targeted. And you run these and use whatever is your favorite tool to figure out the impact of these campaigns and figure out what impact they've had on engagement and conversion and so on. And we keep feeding that back into our Gen AI, so it keeps optimizing these sequences, and we get a very effective way now of introducing the key features to the right set of users. So we get different features for different sets of users. Some samples of what this looks like, some of the output, is, here's an example from Superhuman, where they're focusing on two different features here that I'm being nudged for. One is this remind me feature, and another one is this multi-select feature that they have. So, and then by the way, Notion here, where they're introducing me to the slash commands, the subpages, and Notion AI. And they're not just telling me about the feature. They're telling me that the feature exists, they're telling me what it does, and they're telling me how to use it. We're finding that we can run test after test in an automated way to find out which of these features is best, most relevant for which users, and which content is going to compel them to act. The second thing we can do in the introduce area, if the first one was these nudge campaigns, the second thing is not just doing these as marketing campaigns, but having a more holistic view, and this is where we want to get the product team involved, and focus on introducing these same features in context. And when I say in context, that's the critical thing. It's less about how do we introduce, when we're talking about in-app, it's less about how do we introduce the feature, and it's more about when do we introduce the feature. And in context means you're introducing a feature at a point when that feature itself is likely relevant to what the user is doing at that moment, and therefore there's an increased likelihood that they will actually use it. So here's an example from Google Maps, where this was at the time when Apple Maps was gaining a lot of traction, and Google Maps on iOS was getting quite worried. So we came up with a feature that we called pit stops, which allowed you to find stops for restroom breaks and gas and food along an existing navigation route. And then we did the typical thing that we normally do, which is every time anybody opened up the app for the first time after we launched this feature, we had a pop-up saying, hey, pit stops now exist, go use them. But most people, they weren't going on a long navigation at that point in time, so they reflexively close that out and then promptly forget about that feature even existing. So everyone saw it, and very, very few people used it. So then we rethought about how do we introduce it in context, not just when you open the app, but when are you more likely to actually want to use it? And the answer, in retrospect, was pretty straightforward. That whenever you're navigating on a trip that's going to be more than 2 hours, for example, that's the time when you may want to actually include a pit stop. And if you've never used it, we would just put this little message at the bottom. And what we saw was, even though far fewer people were exposed to that message, many, many more people ended up using it because we introduced it at the right time. So when you're talking about features, it's not just making sure they know about it, it's making sure they know about it at a time when they're likely to use it, because that's how they're going to remember it. And a third thing is, we were talking about how to motivate users to use a feature once they're aware of it. One of the key ways is making them aware of the different use cases. So they know about a feature, they're not exactly sure when they should use it, or maybe they're using it in one narrow way, but they don't know all these other ways they could use it, which would drive more engagement for them. If you look at ChatGPT here, and we've all seen this 100 times, but it's really brilliant that on their homepage, particularly at the stage Gen AI is right now, a lot of people aren't even fully aware of the things you can do with it. There's so many articles on, here's all these great ways to use Gen AI. So ChatGPT does a great job of giving you all the different ways you can use it to give you motivation. And bonus points, it changes each time you go back to the homepage. You can see the two different screenshots, one right after another. It gives me these two different options. So it cycles through dozens of use cases. Another example here is with Loom, where they have on their homepage a list of all these different use cases. They have sample videos that you can watch. And like the one in the upper right is, you can use, it's called Loom Use Case Copy Feedback. You can use it to provide feedback on marketing copy. Or the one on the lower left is, you can use Loom to send a status update to your team. So it's helping motivate me, and we can do these both in-app and through marketing campaigns as well. So that wraps up the part on the introduce. Now we're getting to the assist part. This is the last step. And what the goal here is to assist users in successfully using a feature to get the value out of it. I have a designer friend who always tells me that if you have to help someone use a feature, that is a design failure. And though I do agree that optimally we want to build features so that they're so intuitive, we don't need to provide any assistance for anyone, there are many cases when we just don't know how to make it that intuitive. And we do need to provide assistance so that they'll be able to use it successfully. Because if they have success with it, that's a reward for using it, and if you get positive rewards, you repeat what you just did, it drives engagement, drives monetization, retention, and so on. Let me talk about 3 different ways that we can focus on providing assistance in how to use the features that we've identified as key features. One of the most common assistance mechanisms that we see in apps is the onboarding flow. Historically, what we've done is we've created one onboarding flow, generally for all users, and they all go through the same flow. If we have more resources, then we maybe come up with 2 or 3 different versions of the onboarding flow for different key user segments. But really, that's it. And that's kind of where we get stuck. With Gen AI, we can now complement what we do in-app with these external campaigns. And these external campaigns can use the same cohorts and use the same key features we identified back in the analyze phase. And now we can create these email sequences that give them to-dos or next steps or introduce them to particular features. So we now have a much more robust way of onboarding people. It's not just that when they're in the app, we're walking them through things. We can also help them onboard even when they're not in the app by now reaching out to them through marketing channels. And this is an example from Fireflies, which is an automated note taker. And you can see, yes, when I went on, it told me exactly what to do. For the first 2 weeks, I got a different email every 2 or 3 days. And here's just an example of a few of them, where it's telling me what to do, reinforcing what the message was in the app to drive more engagement and more growth. Second thing we can do, and this is mostly in the app itself, is empty state. What I mean by empty states, we all have the experience of where you're using an app and you click on a tab or something in the navigation bar for the first time, and you get a mostly empty screen that essentially says, nothing here yet. Leaving that empty is a terrible waste of an opportunity. You should be using that space to help explain what that feature is, what the benefits are, explain what to do first to start using it, and give them more resources if they want to learn more about it. So an example here comes from Calendar, and they have this users feature. And when I click on that, instead of getting, and I never clicked on it before, instead of getting the standard, you haven't added any users yet, this is the page I get. And first of all, you can see that they're kind of following those 4 main points. They're explaining what the feature does. They're explaining the benefits. They give me a clear call to action with that big blue button that says invite teammates. And if I want to find out more, they have a link, a learn more link, which will show me additional information. And then the last point about assisting users and how to be successful, which therefore will drive more engagement and more growth, is the use of templates. You want to provide templates that the most useful ones are the ones where you're providing expertise that your users probably don't have, particularly new users. So for example, in Canva, they have tons of professionally designed templates that I can use. So that's expertise I don't have, and they help me make everything that I create look professional. Or an example here with Airtable. Airtable has a pretty steep learning curve. So what they do is they provide a couple sample apps. And it's not so much that I'm going to use the apps as they are. That's the way they've taken these professional Airtable app creators and build these widgets. And I can go in there, look at how they did something and learn from that, and then edit that and use it the way I want. So they're providing expertise, a professional on Airtable to help me, someone who's new, get up to speed quickly. So that really wraps up the 4 areas of the ARIA framework. And it hopefully has given you kind of a blueprint, a repeatable process for how to drive growth by not always focusing on new features, by focusing on the features you already have. And it's been used successfully at dozens of companies, and it has now been supercharged where companies are using AI in the way we just saw. It's been supercharged to make it even more impactful. And I only touched the surface of some of it. Again, you can go to bit.ly, Ken Lenny, if you want to get more details. But hopefully this gives you a good start. So thank you very much.